I was born Anthony Salerno on a sweltering August morning in 1911, when East Harlem was a symphony of languages, and the American dream felt close enough to touch if you knew where to reach. My father, Alfonso, carried the dust of Sicily in his lungs and the weight of possibility in his calloused hands. He'd arrived just 2 years before I drew my first breath, with my mother Maria clutching a faded photograph of the village they'd left behind. They settled into a tenement on 106th Street, where the fire escapes created a lattice of shadows against brick walls that had already absorbed the hopes and sorrows of a dozen immigrant families. I remember being small enough to slip between the legs of men conducting business on street corners, their voices dropping to whispers when certain names were mentioned. The neighborhood had its own language, its own rules, and even as a boy, I understood that some conversations were meant for shadows and others for sunlight. My mother would call me in from the street when those whispered conferences began, but I had already learned to listen with more than my ears. Alfonso worked construction when there was work to be had, his hands growing more weathered with each passing season. I'd watch him count coins at the kitchen table by lamplight, his fingers moving across copper pennies like a rosary. Maria would stand behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder, and in those moments our small apartment felt like a cathedral of quiet determination. The sounds of our building were a lullaby I knew by heart. Mrs. Downed, Torino's infant crying 2 flights up, the Morettis arguing in rapid Italian next door, the pipes groaning their metallic songs through walls thin enough to share secrets. I learned to navigate by sound, to know which footstep belonged to which neighbor, which door would slam and which would close with the soft click of someone trying not to wake a sleeping child. School felt like a foreign country where I was always a visitor. The teachers spoke with crisp consonants that bounced off the high ceilings of classrooms that smelled of chalk and unfulfilled potential. I sat in wooden desks carved with the initials of boys who'd come before me, wondering if they'd found what they were looking for in those lessons about presidents and proper grammar. By the time I was old enough to understand the mathematics of necessity, I realized that the streets offered a different kind of education. The numbers runners who worked the neighborhood moved with a purpose that fascinated me. Men who could calculate odds in their heads while walking, who knew every doorway and alley like the lines on their own palms. I began to notice how money moved through our neighborhood like water finding its level. There were those who had it and those who needed it, and in between stood men who understood the delicate art of connection. Policy, the numbers lottery that promised small dreams for pocket change, was woven into the fabric of daily life, like the smell of bread from Rossetti's bakery or the sound of children playing stickball in the street. The first time I carried a slip of paper with numbers written in pencil, I felt the weight of responsibility settle across my shoulders like my father's work coat. The man who handed it to me, Tommy Torino from the second floor, looked at me with eyes that seemed to see something I didn't yet understand about myself. "You got steady hands, kid," he said, "and a face people trust." Walking through the neighborhood with those precious slips, I began to see the intricate web that connected every storefront, every tenement, every corner where men gathered to smoke and talk. There was an order to it all, a hierarchy that functioned with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. At the top were names whispered with respect, men like Michael Coppola, who they called Trigger Mike, though I never heard anyone explain why. The 106th Street crew operated from the shadows of respectability, their business conducted in barbershops that stayed open late and social clubs where the wine was always Italian and the conversation always careful. I learned to recognize the subtle signs of their influence, the way certain merchants nodded when specific customers entered, how some conversations stopped when footsteps approached, the particular quality of silence that meant important business was being discussed. My role was small but essential, like a single thread in a tapestry that would only reveal its pattern when viewed from a distance. I carried messages, memorized numbers, and learned to read the expressions on faces that had mastered the art of revealing nothing. Each successful delivery earned me a few coins and a growing reputation for reliability. The neighborhood watched me grow with the patient attention of a community that understood the value of investing in its own. Mrs. Benedetto would slip me an extra piece of bread when I passed her window. Ginelli would nod approvingly when he saw me walking with purpose, rather than wandering aimlessly like some of the other boys my age. At home, my parents asked few questions about the coins that found their way into our family's modest treasury. Alfonso's construction work was seasonal and unpredictable, and Maria's sewing brought in barely enough to supplement our income. The extra money I contributed was accepted with the quiet gratitude of people who understood that survival sometimes required flexibility in one's definition of conventional employment. I began to understand that respect in our neighborhood was earned through consistency rather than grand gestures. The men I admired most were those who kept their word, who could be counted on when circumstances became complicated, who understood that true power lay not in making noise, but in making things happen quietly and efficiently. The policy business taught me mathematics that no classroom could offer, the odds of various number combinations, the delicate balance between risk and reward, the way hope could be measured in nickels and dimes. I learned to read people's faces when they placed their bets, to understand the difference between desperation and optimism, between gambling and investing in possibility. As 1920 approached and whispers of prohibition grew louder in the cafes and barbershops, I sensed that change was coming to our world like weather moving across the harbor. The men who controlled the policy games spoke in hushed tones about new opportunities, about the ways that foolish laws might create profitable circumstances for those wise enough to adapt. I was still young enough to believe that the future was something I could shape with my own hands, old enough to understand that the choices I made in these formative years would echo through all the days to come. The neighborhood that had raised me was preparing for transformation, and I felt myself being drawn deeper into its hidden currents, ready to discover what kind of man I was meant to become. The numbers never lied to me, even when everything else in my world seemed built on shifting sand. I remember sitting in that cramped back office above Torino's bakery in 1936, the smell of fresh bread drifting up through the floorboards while I balanced the policy books by lamplight. My fingers were stained with ink, my shirt collar damp with perspiration, despite the October chill that crept through the windows. Each entry had to be perfect, every bet recorded, every payout calculated to the penny. In those days, I was just Anthony from East Harlem, keeping the bank windows running smooth for men whose names carried weight I could barely imagine. I learned early that precision was survival. The policy game might have looked like chaos to outsiders, all those desperate souls placing nickels and dimes on three-digit numbers, hoping Lady Luck would smile on them when the evening draws came in from the clearinghouse. But beneath that apparent randomness lay a mathematical beauty that spoke to something deep in my soul. I could see patterns where others saw only chance, could predict the flow of money like reading the weather in cloud formations. My mother used to watch me work at our kitchen table, her dark eyes reflecting the concern that only an Italian mother could carry. "Antonio," she would whisper, using the name she'd given me in honor of her father back in Palermo, "these numbers, they eat men's souls." She would cross herself and return to her sewing, but I knew she understood. In our neighborhood, legitimate work meant breaking your back for pennies while other men grew fat on your sweat. The numbers offered something different, a chance to use your mind instead of your muscles. The ledgers became my companions through those long nights. Each page told stories of hope and desperation, of families betting their grocery money on dreams of easy fortune. Mrs. Benedetto from Lexington Avenue, always playing her late husband's birthday. Young Tommy Ricci, convinced that his dead brother was sending him lucky numbers through dreams. I recorded their faith with the same care a priest might handle communion wine, understanding that I held more than mere gambling records in my hands. The winter of 1937 brought changes that would reshape my understanding of power and responsibility. Salvatore Coppola, the man who ran our crew with the casual authority of a neighborhood king, began trusting me with more than just bookkeeping. I found myself sitting in on meetings where decisions affected hundreds of families, where a wrong word could mean the difference between prosperity and poverty for entire blocks of our community. Coppola was a study in contrasts, a man who could discuss Dante's Inferno with genuine scholarly passion one moment, then orchestrate a complex Shylocking operation the next. His office in the back of Romano's restaurant became my second education, where I learned that true power lay not in violence or intimidation, but in understanding human nature so completely that you could predict what people would do before they knew it themselves. Anthony, he would say, his voice carrying the weight of old-world wisdom, the street teaches you to read faces, but the books teach you to read souls. A man might lie with his words, even with his expressions, but his spending habits, his betting patterns. These things reveal truth that even he doesn't recognize. I absorbed these lessons like dry earth soaks up rain. The policy game wasn't simply about collecting bets and paying winners. It was about becoming the emotional and financial center of a community's aspirations. People didn't just trust us with their money, they trusted us with their dreams, their fears, their most desperate hopes for a better tomorrow. The Palmer Boys Social Club stood on the corner of 115th Street and Pleasant Avenue, like a lighthouse in our sea of tenements and struggling businesses. From the outside, it appeared unremarkable, just another storefront with painted windows and a simple wooden door. But inside, the club pulsed with the quiet energy of serious men conducting serious business. The walls held photographs of neighborhood champions, local heroes, and family patriarchs whose word carried more weight than any court judgment. I began spending my evenings there, initially just delivering reports and collecting instructions, but gradually becoming part of the fabric of the place. The older men would nod approvingly as I demonstrated my grasp of complex financial arrangements, my ability to spot potential problems before they blossomed into crises. They appreciated precision, and precision had become my signature. The club's main room featured a massive oak table that had witnessed countless negotiations, celebrations, and solemn discussions about neighborhood justice. The air always carried traces of expensive cigars and strong coffee, punctuated by the soft click of dominoes and the whispered conversations that shaped our corner of Manhattan. I felt privileged to witness this world, to understand how decisions flowed from that table out into the streets, affecting everything from who received loans to which businesses would thrive or struggle. By 1940, I had developed my own network of runners and collectors, young men who looked to me the way I'd once looked to Coppola. Teaching them the importance of accuracy and discretion, I began to understand the profound responsibility that came with leadership. These weren't just employees, they were neighbors' sons, young men whose futures depended partly on the wisdom of my guidance and the soundness of my judgment. The war years brought both opportunity and complexity to our operations. With so many young men overseas and defense plants running around the clock, money flowed through the neighborhood in ways we had never experienced. Factory workers with steady paychecks became regular players, and the volume of business strained our existing systems. I found myself designing new procedures, creating safeguards to handle the increased cash flow while maintaining the personal touch that kept our customers loyal. During those years, I also learned to navigate the delicate relationships between our world and the larger forces that shaped the city. Police captains who needed to maintain order while understanding the economic realities of their precincts. Political figures who recognized that neighborhood stability often depended on informal leadership structures that complemented official authority. Labor organizers who knew that certain problems required solutions that courts and bureaucrats couldn't provide. The evening in 1948, when everything changed, began like any other. I was reviewing the day's receipts in my small office behind the club when Coppola appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine concern. The news came in fragments, a situation downtown that had escalated beyond anyone's ability to control, investigations that threatened to expose relationships and arrangements that had existed for decades. "Anthony," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the careful movements of a man carrying invisible weight. "Sometimes a tree must shed its branches to survive the storm. His eyes held a sadness that spoke of endings and beginnings, of responsibilities passing from one generation to the next like family heirlooms too precious to be lost. I remember 1957 like it was painted in sepia tones, the way old photographs fade, but somehow become more beautiful with time. I stood somewhere in between, watching, learning, building something that would outlast us all. The morning I heard about Appalachin, I was sitting in Rouse nursing an espresso that had gone cold while I read the racing forms. The November air outside carried that particular bite that makes you grateful for warm places and familiar faces. Vinnie Marrow slid into the booth across from me, his face pale as winter sky, and I knew before he opened his mouth that something had shifted in our world. "They got everybody up there, Fat Tony," he whispered, using the name that had stuck to me like cologne. Some people wore it, others couldn't shake it. The whole commission sitting around that farmhouse like they were planning a church picnic. But I hadn't been there. I'd been invited, of course. My operations in East Harlem and the Bronx had grown beyond anyone's expectations, including my own. Numbers, loan sharking, labor racketeering. By then, the FBI would later estimate we were pulling in money that most legitimate businesses could only dream of. 50 million a year, they'd claim, though I always found their bookkeeping more creative than ours. Still, I hadn't made the trip to that little town upstate where the trees were probably just finishing their autumn show. Something had told me to stay away. Call it instinct, call it luck, or maybe just the caution that keeps a man breathing in a business where carelessness is often terminal. While my colleagues sat around Joe Barbara's dining room table, discussing territories and percentages, I was in my office above the social club on 116th Street, watching the neighborhood kids play stickball in the fading afternoon light. That's when I understood something that would shape everything that came after. Sometimes the most important meetings are the ones you don't attend. Sometimes survival is about knowing when to step back from the table, even when everyone else is still playing cards. The newspapers went crazy, of course. Headlines screaming about the Mafia convention, and photographs of men in expensive overcoats being led away in handcuffs. I studied those pictures the way a general studies battlefield maps, memorizing faces, noting who was there and who wasn't, understanding that the landscape of our world had just been redrawn by flashbulbs and police badges. That evening, I drove up to Rhinebeck to check on the property I'd been considering. 100 acres of rolling hills and old stone walls, the kind of place where you could raise horses and pretend the city was just a bad dream. The seller was an elderly widow whose husband had made his fortune in textiles, and she walked me through the grounds as the sun set behind the mountains, painting everything gold and peaceful. "It's been in our family for 30 years, she told me, her voice carrying the weight of memory. "My husband used to say this land had a way of healing whatever troubles a man brought to it. I bought it that night, writing a check that represented more money than my father had seen in his entire life working the docks. But it wasn't about the money. It was about understanding that a man needs places to retreat to, places where the noise of the city and the weight of responsibility can't follow, places where you can remember who you were before the world told you who you had to become. The Appalachin raid changed everything, even for those of us who weren't there. The federal government had gotten a clear picture of how we operated, who the players were, and they didn't like what they saw. But for me, it also represented an opportunity. While others were dealing with lawyers and grand juries, I was quietly expanding, carefully building relationships, learning that the real power often belonged to those who stayed in the shadows. I started spending more time at the track, not just for the gambling, but for the conversations that happened between races. Horse racing was where legitimate businessmen and men like me could meet on neutral ground, where a handshake might seal a deal worth more than most people's houses. I remember standing at the rail at Belmont, watching a beautiful 3-year-old named Bold Ruler stretch his legs, and realizing that there was poetry in power when it was exercised with patience and precision. The Miami Beach house came next, a Mediterranean revival palace with 20 rooms and a view of the ocean that made you understand why men spent their lives chasing horizons. I would sit on the terrace in the evenings, drinking aged scotch and watching the sun disappear into the water, thinking about how far I'd come from the tenements of East Harlem, where the only view was of other people's laundry hanging between the buildings. But it was the Patterson-Johansson fight that really showed me how the worlds I moved between could come together. Yankee Stadium, June 1959, and I was one of the men who made it happen. Sitting ringside, watching two gladiators dance around each other under the lights, surrounded by 70,000 people who had no idea that some of the most important conversations of the evening were happening in the VIP boxes. Floyd Patterson was the defending champion, a quiet, thoughtful man who carried himself with dignity both in and out of the ring. Ingemar Johansson was the Swedish challenger, blonde and confident, representing something new and foreign in American boxing. The fight itself was poetry and violence combined, each round building toward a conclusion that would surprise everyone. When Johansson dropped Patterson in the third round, the stadium erupted like a volcano. I watched from my seat, admiring not just the power of the punch, but the precision of it, the way Johansson had waited for exactly the right moment to deliver exactly the right blow. There were lessons in that ring that applied to every aspect of life, if you knew how to read them. After the fight, in the quiet luxury of a private club in Manhattan, I sat with men who controlled shipping companies, construction unions, and entertainment venues. We talked about the future, about opportunities, about the delicate balance between legitimate business and the kind of ventures that required more discretion. These conversations happened in smoky rooms where handshakes carried the weight of contracts and a man's word was worth more than any legal document. I had learned by then that true power wasn't about fear or violence. It was about understanding people, about knowing what they wanted and finding ways to give it to them while advancing your own interests. It was about building networks that could weather any storm, relationships that could survive any scandal. The magazine writers would later claim I was worth $100 million by the end of the decade, which always made me smile. They had no understanding of how we really operated, how wealth in our world wasn't just about money in banks, but about influence, about the ability to make things happen or prevent them from happening, about being the man other men came to when they needed problems solved. But sitting here now, looking back across all those years, I realized that the real wealth was in the moments between the headlines, the quiet conversations in dimly lit restaurants, the satisfaction of a well-executed plan, the respect that came not from fear but from competence. It was in understanding that every empire, whether built on steel or shadows, ultimately rested on the foundation of human relationships and the delicate architecture of trust and loyalty. The 1950s were ending, and I could feel the new decade approaching like a distant train, carrying changes that none of us could fully anticipate. But I was ready for whatever came next, grounded in the lessons I'd learned and the alliances I'd built, secure in the knowledge that survival in any world requires not just strength, but wisdom, patience, and the ability to see around corners that others don't even know exist. I've always believed that a man's life can be measured not by the money he counts, but by the moments he remembers when the counting is done. Tonight, as I sit in this leather chair that has molded itself to my body over countless evenings, I find myself thinking about numbers. Not the kind that filled my days for so many years, but the kind that mark a life, the breaths taken, the decisions made, the people loved and lost. The year 1960 found me standing at a crossroads I hadn't expected. I was 37 years old, and the East Harlem streets that had raised me were changing. The old neighborhood rhythms, the morning calls of vendors, the evening gatherings on stoops, the familiar faces that had populated my world since childhood, all of it was shifting like sand beneath my feet. You could curse it, or you could learn to read its patterns and move accordingly. I remember the morning when everything crystallized for me. It was October, and the air carried that particular crispness that makes New York feel like the center of the universe. I was walking down Pleasant Avenue, past the social club where my grandfather used to play cards, when I realized that the numbers game, this intricate web of bets and payouts that pulsed through every neighborhood like a heartbeat, had become something larger than any of us had imagined. The numbers weren't just about gambling anymore. They were about hope, about the possibility that tomorrow could be different from today. Every morning, people would place their small bets with the quiet faith that maybe, just maybe, their 3 digits would come up. In a world where so many felt powerless, the numbers gave them agency, however small, and I had somehow become the architect of their dreams. My operation had grown organically, like a tree spreading its roots through the soil of the neighborhood. What had started as small-time work in the 1940s had evolved into something that touched every corner of East Harlem and beyond. I employed hundreds of people, runners, collectors, bookkeepers, all of them feeding families, all of them part of an economy that existed in the spaces between the official world and the streets. But success, I was learning, brought its own complications. The bigger you became, the more attention you attracted, and not all of that attention was welcome. I found myself needing counsel that went beyond the street wisdom I'd relied on for so many years. That's when someone mentioned Roy Cohn's name to me. Roy was a different breed entirely, a lawyer who moved in circles I'd only read about in newspapers. When I first met him in his Manhattan office with its floor-to-ceiling law books and windows that looked down on the city like the eyes of a watchful god, I felt the weight of 2 worlds meeting. Here was a man who understood power in all its forms, legal, political, social. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world, yet there was something in his eyes that suggested he understood the shadows as well as the light. "Anthony," he said during one of our early conversations, his voice carrying the authority of expensive education and expensive suits, "you built something impressive. But impressive things require protection, and protection requires understanding the rules of the game. All the rules, not just the ones they teach you on the street." I appreciated his directness. In my world, straight talk was a form of respect, and Roy, for all his polish, was refreshingly straight. He helped me navigate the legal complexities that came with running an operation of my size, but more than that, he helped me understand how power really worked in America. Not just the power of muscle and intimidation, which I had known since childhood, but the subtler power of influence and connection. Through Roy, I began to see the broader landscape of American business and politics. I learned that the line between legitimate and illegitimate enterprise was often thinner than most people imagined, and that success in any field required understanding not just your customers and competitors, but the entire ecosystem in which you operated. The numbers business taught me patience in ways I hadn't expected. Every day brought thousands of small transactions, each one a tiny act of faith. People would hand over their quarters and dollars with a mixture of hope and resignation that I found deeply moving. Benedetto from Alla 16th Street played the same 3 numbers every day for 15 years, her late husband's birthday. Tommy the barber always bet on whatever numbers appeared in his dreams the night before. Maria from the bakery played her children's ages, updating her bet every year as they grew. She stood in the middle of Pleasant Avenue, tears streaming down her face, holding the money like it was a message from her husband himself. In that moment, I understood that what we provided wasn't just the possibility of winning money. We provided the possibility of magic in ordinary lives. But the business demanded more than sentiment. It required precision, organization, and an almost mathematical understanding of risk and probability. I spent hours each week analyzing patterns, adjusting payouts, ensuring that the operation remained profitable while still offering genuine opportunities for players to win. It was a delicate balance, too conservative, and we would lose customers to competitors, too generous, and we would bankrupt ourselves. I developed systems that would have impressed any Wall Street trader. We tracked everything, which numbers were played most frequently, which neighborhoods generated the most action, which times of day saw the heaviest betting. I could tell you that Fridays were always our biggest days, that people bet more optimistically when the weather was good, that certain news events, a local wedding, a neighborhood tragedy would influence the numbers people chose. The organization itself became a source of pride. I employed people who might otherwise have struggled to find steady work. Men with criminal records who couldn't get hired elsewhere. Women who needed flexible schedules to care for their families. Young people who were smart and ambitious but lacked formal education. We provided not just jobs, but a kind of alternative economy where loyalty and competence mattered more than credentials. My lieutenants were men I had known for years, people whose judgment I trusted completely. There was Salvatore, who had grown up 3 blocks from me and understood the neighborhood rhythms, like a jazz musician understands time signatures. There was Vincent, whose mathematical mind could calculate odds and payouts faster than most people could count to 10. And there was Frank, whose quiet intensity and absolute reliability made him invaluable for the delicate work of managing relationships with law enforcement. Because, of course, law enforcement was always a factor. The police knew what we did, we knew that they knew. It was an elaborate dance of mutual acknowledgement and careful boundaries. Most of the beat cops in our area were neighborhood guys themselves, men who understood that the numbers game was woven into the fabric of the community in ways that simple law enforcement couldn't address. The smart cops, and most of them were smart, recognized that our operation was relatively benign. We didn't deal drugs to children, we didn't run prostitution, we didn't engage in the kinds of violence that made neighborhoods unsafe. We were, in our way, a stabilizing force, an employer, a source of hope, a part of the community's economic infrastructure. Still, there were periodic crackdowns, usually when political pressure required some visible action against organized crime. These moments demanded careful navigation. You couldn't fight the system directly. That was a war you couldn't win, but you could weather the storms if you were smart about it. Roy's counsel proved invaluable during these times, helping me understand when to lay low, when to cooperate, and when to stand firm. As the early 1960s unfolded, I began to sense that my role was evolving beyond the numbers business. Other operators in other neighborhoods looked to me for guidance. Younger men sought my advice. Even some of the older generation, men who had been in the life since before the war, began to treat me with a deference that both honored and concerned me. I was becoming something I had never set out to become, a leader not just of an operation, but of a community within a community. People brought me their disputes, their problems, their questions about how to handle delicate situations. I found myself mediating between feuding families, advising young men on career decisions, even helping to arrange marriages. This broader role brought its own satisfactions and its own burdens. To be trusted with people's secrets, their hopes, their fears, it was a responsibility I took seriously. My name is Anthony Salerno, though most people who knew me well enough to matter called me Fat Tony, a nickname that carried more affection than cruelty, spoken by men who understood that respect and appearance were 2 entirely different currencies in our world. I had spent decades building an empire that existed in the shadows between legal and illegal, in the grey spaces where a man's word carried more weight than any contract, and where loyalty was the only law that truly mattered. For months I had watched federal investigators circle like patient vultures, building their case brick by careful brick. Gambling, tax evasion, the charges felt almost quaint when spoken aloud in that sterile courtroom, stripped of all the human complexity that had brought me to that moment. They reduced my life's work to numbers on betting slips and unreported income, as if the intricate web of relationships, obligations, and unspoken agreements that formed the backbone of my world could be quantified in their ledgers. I remember Roy Cohn's voice cutting through the courtroom tension like a blade through silk. "Your Honor," he said, with that particular brand of confidence that only comes from years of dancing on the edge of disaster, "Mr. Salerno is nothing more than a sports bettor." The phrase would follow me for years, quoted in newspapers and whispered in courtrooms, though we all knew it was theatre. Roy understood the game we were playing, not just the legal chess match unfolding before the judge, but the larger performance required to maintain the delicate balance between truth and survival. The truth, as I had learned long before that April morning, was far more complicated than any courtroom could contain. I was indeed a man who appreciated the elegant mathematics of a well-placed bet, the way probability and intuition could dance together to create something approaching art. But I was also a husband, a father, a man who had grown up in the streets of East Harlem when the neighborhood still carried the scent of fresh bread from family bakeries and the sound of children speaking 3 languages before they learned to read in English. Those 6 months stretched ahead of me like a long hallway with no windows, but I had walked through darker passages before. The federal facility they assigned me to was clean and orderly, filled with men who had made similar calculations and arrived at similar destinations. We were a strange fraternity, bound together by the shared understanding that the world outside operated according to rules we had chosen not to follow, or perhaps rules that had never been designed to include us in the first place. During those months, I found myself thinking often about the nature of power, not the crude, obvious kind that announced itself with violence or threats, but the subtle variety that moved like water, finding its way around obstacles, shaping the landscape through patience and persistence. From my cell, I could still feel the pulse of my organization, the network of relationships and obligations that continued to function even in my absence. This was perhaps my greatest achievement, building something that could survive without my daily presence, a machine that ran on trust and tradition rather than fear. The Bronx betting operation had become something beautiful in its complexity, a system that served not just my financial interests but the needs of an entire community. Men who worked construction during the day could place small wagers that transformed their lunch breaks into moments of possibility. Neighborhood bookmakers became informal counselors, listening to the hopes and frustrations of customers who saw in each bet a chance to change their circumstances. We provided a service that the legitimate world refused to acknowledge it wanted. My estate in Rhinebeck had become my sanctuary during this period, a place where I could retreat from the constant calculations required by my professional life. The property sat on rolling hills that reminded me of the Italian countryside my grandparents had described in stories told over Sunday dinners. Here, among the carefully tended gardens and stone pathways, I could pretend for brief moments that I was simply a man who appreciated beauty and solitude. The house itself was modest by some standards. I had never been drawn to the ostentatious displays that mark some of my contemporaries. Instead, I preferred spaces that felt lived in and comfortable, rooms where a man could think without distraction. My study became my favorite retreat, lined with books that ranged from military history to poetry, volumes that helped me understand the patterns that governed human behavior across centuries and cultures. It was in this study, on a grey morning in January 1981, that I felt the first strange sensation in my left arm. The feeling started as a tingling, like the pins and needles that come from sleeping in an awkward position, but it spread and deepened until I could no longer ignore its message. The stroke, when it came, felt almost anticlimactic, a brief moment of disconnection from my own body, followed by a return to consciousness that carried with it the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted. The doctors spoke to me in the careful language that medical professionals reserve for powerful men who are no longer quite as powerful as they once were. Mild stroke, good recovery prospects, but I understood what they were really telling me. My body had begun the process of negotiating its own terms, independent of my will or wishes. For a man who had spent his life controlling variables and managing outcomes, this was perhaps the most humbling lesson of all. Recovery became its own kind of education. I learned to move more slowly, to listen more carefully to the signals my body was sending. The estate in Rhinebeck transformed from a weekend retreat into a place of rehabilitation, where I relearned basic functions while maintaining my oversight of the complex network that continued to depend on my guidance. My underboss duties remained unchanged. The Bronx and East Harlem operations still required my attention, my judgment, my ability to read the subtle currents that determined success or failure in our particular corner of the world. What surprised me most during this period was the gentleness that crept into my daily routine. Mornings began with careful attention to physical therapy exercises that reminded me of the basic miracle of movement. Afternoons were spent in quiet consultation with trusted associates who traveled to Rhinebeck to discuss matters that required my input. Evenings belonged to reflection, to the slow work of understanding how a life could change direction without losing its essential character. The newspapers, when they wrote about me at all during this time, focused on the dramatic elements, the conviction, the health scare, the questions about succession and control. But they missed the quieter story, the human story of a man learning to navigate the space between who he had been and who he was becoming. They couldn't see the way I'd begun to appreciate smaller pleasures, the taste of perfectly prepared coffee, the satisfaction of a conversation that revealed unexpected depths in long-time associates, the peace that came from watching the seasons change through the windows of my study. My world had not shrunk exactly, but it had become more concentrated, more intentional. Each decision carried additional weight because I understood, in a way I had not before, that the number of decisions remaining to me was finite. This knowledge didn't paralyze me. If anything, it sharpened my focus, helped me distinguish between the essential and the merely urgent in ways that served both my organization and my peace of mind. As winter turned to spring in 1981, I found myself thinking often about legacy, not the crude measurements of wealth or territory that outsiders might use to judge a life like mine, but the more subtle inheritance of relationships maintained, obligations honored, and traditions preserved. The betting empire I'd built in the Bronx and East Harlem would outlive me, but only if it continued to serve the deeper human needs that had given it life in the first place. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the estate was wrapped in the kind of silence that seems to hold the whole world in suspension, I would sometimes walk through the rooms of my house and feel the weight of all the choices that had brought me to this moment. Not regret exactly, but a kind of profound acknowledgement of the complexity that defines any life lived fully, without apology or explanation, to those who had never faced similar choices or carried similar responsibilities. This was my world, built one relationship at a time, maintained through careful attention to the unwritten rules that governed our particular corner of human experience, and sustained by the understanding that true power came not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to know when not to use the power you possessed. The weight of a crown isn't in the gold, but in the eyes that watch you wear it. I learned this truth on a cold March morning in 1981, when the old man's funeral cortege wound through the streets of East Harlem like a black snake seeking its den. Frank Thierry was gone, and with him the last of the old guard who remembered when handshakes meant more than contracts, and a man's word was his bond. I stood at the graveside, my breath forming small clouds in the bitter air, watching as they lowered the casket into the frozen earth. The other mourners, men in expensive overcoats with faces carved from granite, nodded at me with a deference I'd grown accustomed to over the years. They called me boss now, had been calling me that since the moment Thierry's heart gave out in his sleep. But titles, I was learning, could be as hollow as the echo in an empty church. The thing about power is that it's never quite what you imagine it to be when you're hungry for it. As a young man running numbers in the village, I used to watch the older guys, the ones with the pinky rings and the respect, and think I understood what they carried. I thought it was just authority, the ability to make things happen with a word or a gesture. I didn't understand then about the weight, about how every decision ripples outward like stones thrown in still water, touching lives you'll never know, changing futures you'll never see. Vincent Gigante understood this weight. Chin, we called him, though never to his face unless you were family, or had earned that privilege through blood or time. He was a different breed than the rest of us, Chin was, where most of us wore our status like badges, the cars, the clothes, the tables at the best restaurants. Vincent moved through the world like smoke, there and not there, powerful and invisible all at once. The morning after Thierry's funeral, I found myself sitting in the back room of a social club on Sullivan Street, the kind of place where old men played cards and argued about baseball, in voices thick with the accents of the old country. The walls were yellow with decades of cigarette smoke, and the espresso machine hissed like an angry cat in the corner. Chin sat across from me, his hands wrapped around a small white cup, steam rising between us like incense. "You know what they're saying about you out there, Fat Tony?" I nodded, sipping my own coffee, feeling the bitter liquid warm my chest. "They're saying I'm the boss. And you know what we both know about that." The truth hung between us like smoke. The real power had shifted months ago, quietly, invisibly, the way important changes always happen. While the newspapers and the FBI files would continue to list Anthony Salerno as the head of the Genovese family, we both understood that Chin had been pulling the strings from the shadows, orchestrating our moves like a conductor with an invisible baton. It should have bothered me, this displacement. Any other man might have felt diminished, reduced, pushed aside, but I'd lived long enough to understand that sometimes the most dangerous place to stand is in the spotlight, and sometimes the most powerful position is the one nobody sees you occupying. The arrangement suited us both. I would be the face they photographed leaving the courthouse, the name they printed in the papers, the target they aimed their investigations at. And Chin would be the mind behind the operation, free to think and plan and orchestrate without the constant glare of federal attention. It was, in its way, a perfect partnership, one that required a certain kind of trust that wasn't common in our world. Trust was a luxury we dealt in carefully. In the concrete business, for instance, where we'd built something beautiful and profitable with our friends from the other families. The Luciuses and the Gambinos understood the value of cooperation, of turning competition into collaboration. We called it the Concrete Club among ourselves, though no such organization officially existed and no business cards were ever printed. The beauty of the arrangement was in its simplicity. Every major construction project in the city, the skyscrapers reaching toward heaven, the convention centers that would host the world, required concrete, and concrete required cooperation. A small percentage, just 2%, flowed back to us for ensuring that everything ran smoothly, that the right workers got the right jobs, that schedules were met and problems were solved before they became crises. I remember standing on the construction site of what would become Trump Tower, watching the concrete trucks roll in like mechanical elephants, their massive drums turning slowly in the afternoon sun. The young developer, Donald Trump, was there that day, his hair catching the light as he gestured enthusiastically at the blueprints spread across a makeshift table. He had ambition, I'll give him that, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no about anything that mattered. "Magnificent, isn't it?" he said to me, sweeping his arm toward the skeleton of steel and promise rising from the earth. "When this is finished, it's going to change everything. People will remember this building." I nodded, watching the workers move with practiced efficiency, each man knowing his role in the larger symphony. "Buildings are like families," I told him. "They're only as strong as their foundations." He looked at me with the kind of sharp attention that successful men develop, the ability to hear the layers beneath the surface of casual conversation. We understood each other, Trump and I, not because we were alike, but because we both appreciated the machinery of ambition, the way individual pieces could be assembled into something larger than their sum. The money from these projects was substantial enough to fund operations, to take care of families, to ensure that the organization could weather the storms that inevitably came our way. But more important than the money was what it represented, our ability to operate in the legitimate world, to have our fingers on the pulse of the city's growth and development. By 1982, when we initiated new members into the family, the structure had become clear to everyone who mattered. I remember the ceremony for Al Darko, a sharp kid from Brooklyn who'd proven himself reliable and discreet. We met in the basement of a house in Queens, the walls lined with religious pictures and the air thick with the smell of old wood and older secrets. The ritual was ancient, unchanged from the days when our predecessors first brought these traditions from Sicily. The paper burning in Al's cupped hands, the words spoken in the old language, the kiss on both cheeks that welcomed him into something larger than himself. But when it came time to explain how things worked, how the modern family functioned, the message was simple and clear. "Vincent Gigante is the boss," I told him, watching his eyes for any flicker of confusion or surprise. "I'm the face you'll see in the newspapers, the name you'll hear on the radio. but Chin makes the decisions that matter. Al nodded, understanding immediately. He was smart enough to grasp the elegance of the arrangement, the way it protected everyone involved. The FBI could follow me to every restaurant, photograph me at every meeting, tap my phones and read my mail, and they'd still be looking at shadows while the real business was conducted elsewhere. It was a kind of performance, this public role I played. Every morning I dressed carefully, selecting the right tie, the right shoes, the right expression to wear as I walked through my neighborhood. The reporters knew my routines, the agents knew my haunts. They'd watch me have lunch at the same restaurant, play cards at the same club, attend the same church on Sunday mornings. What they couldn't photograph or record was the real work. The conversations that happened in moving cars, the decisions made during walks in the park, the delicate negotiations that kept our world running smoothly. While they focused on the theatre of my daily life, the actual business of leadership was happening in places they'd never think to look, conducted by a man they consistently underestimated. The newspapers loved to write about our earnings, throwing around numbers that sounded impressive but rarely reflected reality. 50 million a year, they'd claim, as if we were some kind of criminal corporation with quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. The truth was both simpler and more complex. Yes, money flowed through our operations, but much of it flowed right back out, to lawyers, to families of imprisoned members, to the countless small expenses that came with maintaining an organization that existed in the shadows. My own tax returns from those years told a different story than the newspaper headlines. When the IRS audited me in 1977, they found taxable income of just over $1 million. Substantial money, certainly, but hardly the fortune the press imagined. The difference between gross and profit, between what came in and what you actually kept, was something the outsiders never seemed to grasp. But money was never really the point, not for those of us who'd made it to the top. The point was respect, influence, the ability to solve problems and protect the people who depended on us. The point was maintaining something that our fathers and grandfathers had built, preserving traditions that connected us to something larger than ourselves. As I sit here now, looking back on those days, I can see how perfectly the pieces fit together, Chin in the shadows, pulling strings with the subtlety of a master craftsman, me in the light, absorbing attention and deflecting scrutiny, the concrete flowing through the city like blood through arteries, carrying with it the small tacks that kept our world functioning. It was a delicate balance requiring trust and patience, and the kind of long-term thinking that seemed to be disappearing from the world around us. But for a time, a brief, shining time, it worked perfectly. I never thought I'd live to see the day when they'd call me America's #1 gangster in Fortune magazine. February 1985 had already been a month that would change everything, and by October, there I was, staring at my own face on a glossy cover in a dentist's waiting room of all places. The irony wasn't lost on me sitting there waiting to get my teeth cleaned, while the whole world painted me as some kind of monster. But let me start where it really began, not with the headlines or the court cases, but with a phone call on a Tuesday morning when the snow was still clinging to the fire escapes outside my apartment on Sullivan Street. I remember the way the light filtered through those old windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that creaked with every step I'd taken for the past 20 years. My wife had already left for her sister's place in Brooklyn. She had a way of knowing when storms were coming, even before the weatherman did. The phone rang 3 times before I answered it. In my world, you learn to let things ring. Impatience was a luxury I couldn't afford, not anymore. When I finally picked up the receiver, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, the kind of tone that meant serious business. Mr. Salerno, this is Agent Morrison with the FBI. We need to talk. I set my coffee cup down carefully on the kitchen table, the same table where my mother used to roll out pasta dough when I was a boy. The steam rose from the cup like incense, and for a moment I was transported back to Sunday mornings when the biggest worry of my life was whether the Yankees would win their game. Those days felt like someone else's memories now, borrowed from a life I might have lived in another universe. I'm listening, I said, because in situations like this, the fewer words the better. "You'll want to have your attorney present. We'll be serving papers this afternoon." The line went dead, and I stood there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone mix with the sound of Mrs. Pang, Benedetto's television next door. She was watching her morning stories, the same soap opera she'd been following for 15 years. I envied her that consistency, that simple pleasure of caring about fictional people with fictional problems. I walked to the window and looked down at the street where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to navigate the complex web of loyalties and obligations that would eventually define my entire existence. The neighborhood had changed over the years. Some faces disappeared. New ones took their place, but the rhythm remained the same. People hurried to work. Mothers pushed strollers. Old men gathered at the corner to argue about politics and baseball. Life continuing as it always had, as it always would, regardless of whatever storm was about to break over my head. That's when I knew the February 25th indictment was coming. They called it the Mafia Commission case, like we were some kind of corporate board meeting gone wrong. RICO charges, labor racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, words that sounded so clinical, so removed from the reality of how things actually worked in my world. But I understood what they were really trying to do. They wanted to take apart the entire structure piece by piece, starting with the people they thought were holding it all together. I thought about my father then, how he used to tell me that a man's word was the only currency that truly mattered. "Anthony," he'd say, sitting in his chair by the radio after dinner, "you can lose money, you can lose property, you can even lose your freedom. But once you lose your word, you lose everything that makes you a man." He'd been dead for 10 years by then, but I could still smell his aftershave, still hear the way he'd clear his throat before saying something important. The irony was that everything they were accusing me of came down to that same principle: keeping your word, honoring your obligations, protecting the people who depended on you. The methods might have been different from what my father had in mind, but the core remained the same. In a world where legal contracts could be broken by expensive lawyers and political connections, could override justice, we'd created our own system of accountability. It wasn't perfect, God knows it wasn't perfect, but it was honest in its own way. I made myself another cup of coffee and sat down to think. The apartment was quiet, except for the radiator's gentle hissing and the distant sound of traffic on Houston Street. This was the calm before the storm, and I'd learned to treasure these moments of stillness. Soon enough there would be lawyers and reporters and courtrooms filled with people who thought they understood my life based on newspaper headlines and government theories. But as I sat in that apartment, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door, I found myself thinking not about money or power or even freedom, but about time. How it moved differently when you knew it was running out. How ordinary moments became precious when you realized you might not have many more of them. The way the afternoon light slanted across the kitchen table, the sound of children playing in the courtyard below, the familiar weight of my father's watch on my wrist, ticking away the seconds with the same steady rhythm it had kept for 40 years. I thought about the choices that had brought me to this point, the roads taken and the ones left unexplored. In another life, I might have been a businessman, maybe even a legitimate one. I had the mind for it, the ability to see patterns, to understand what motivated people, to build something lasting from nothing but vision and determination. But circumstances, family, the neighborhood, the times we lived in, all of it had conspired to channel those abilities in a different direction. Looking back now, I don't regret the path I chose, but I do wonder about the paths I didn't. What would it have been like to worry about quarterly earnings instead of federal indictments? To attend board meetings instead of sit-downs? To build an empire with stock options instead of street corners? These weren't the kind of thoughts that kept me awake at night. I'd made peace with my choices long ago, but they drifted through my mind like smoke from a cigarette, there and gone, leaving only the faintest trace of what might have been. The knock, when it finally came, was exactly what I'd expected. Firm but not aggressive, professional but not apologetic. I opened the door to find two agents in dark suits, their faces carefully neutral, their movements precise and economical. They were young, probably fresh out of Quantico, but their eyes held the kind of focus that told me they understood the gravity of what they were doing. "Mr. Anthony Salerno?" one of them asked, though we all knew the answer. "That's me," I said, stepping back to let them enter. There was no point in making it difficult. In my world, how you handled the inevitable said everything about who you were as a man. As they read me my rights, I found myself studying their faces, wondering what they saw when they looked at me: a criminal, a businessman. An old man in a bathrobe drinking coffee. All of the above? None of the above. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any single perspective could capture, but complexity had never been popular with newspapers or prosecutors or juries looking for simple answers to complicated questions. I remember the weight of that January morning in 1987, the kind of cold that seeps through your bones and settles in your chest like an old regret. The courtroom felt smaller than it had during all those months of testimony, as if the walls had been slowly closing in while I wasn't paying attention. Judge Owen's voice carried across the room with the finality of church bells, each word falling like snow that would never melt. 100 years. The number hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible, like trying to count all the stars I'd seen from my bedroom window as a child in East Harlem. I sat there in my best suit, the charcoal grey one my tailor on Mulberry Street had pressed with such care that morning, and felt the strange calm that comes when the worst thing imaginable finally arrives. It's peculiar how the mind works in moments like these. Instead of thinking about the sentence or the appeals or what my lawyers were whispering behind me, I found myself remembering the smell of my grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, the way the light filtered through her lace curtains and painted patterns on the linoleum floor. The newspapers would write their stories, of course. They always did. They'd use words like supreme boss and mastermind, painting me as some kind of emperor ruling from a throne of shadows. But sitting there, listening to the judge's words echo off those courtroom walls, I knew something they didn't. I knew the truth about what I really was, what I'd always been, a man standing in front of other men taking the weight they couldn't carry themselves. You see, there's a difference between being the boss and being the one everyone looks to when the heat gets too intense. I learned this lesson early. Growing up in a neighborhood where respect wasn't given, it was earned through small acts of loyalty and large gestures of protection. My father worked the docks, came home each night with hands that told stories of honest labor and eyes that carried the exhaustion of a man who understood his place in the world. He taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand between the storm and the people you care about, even when that storm has your name on it. The courtroom tape they played during the trial captured a moment that would follow me for the rest of my days. I'll leave this up to the boss, my voice echoing through speakers that made even my own words sound foreign to me. The prosecutors seized on those words like treasure hunters finding gold, holding them up as proof of some grand hierarchy they'd constructed in their minds. But they misunderstood what they were hearing. They thought they'd caught a glimpse behind the curtain, when really they were just watching a man do what he'd been doing his whole life. Deflecting attention, absorbing pressure, keeping the machinery running smooth. I think about loyalty often, especially during those long nights when sleep comes hard, and the shadows on the ceiling remind me of faces I've known and lost. Loyalty isn't just about keeping your mouth shut or following orders. Real loyalty is about understanding your role in something bigger than yourself and playing that role so well that everyone else can sleep peacefully. It's about being the lightning rod that draws the storm away from the people who matter. The months leading up to that final day in court had been like watching a slow-motion avalanche. You could see it coming from miles away. The way the prosecutors built their case brick by brick, the way the newspapers started using words like inevitable and downfall. My lawyers, good men who understood the law better than I understood the streets, kept talking about appeals and technicalities and reasonable doubt. But I'd been in this business long enough to recognize the sound of doors closing, one by one, until you're standing in a room with no way out except the one marked dignity. There were nights during the trial when I'd sit in my study, surrounded by law books my attorneys had left behind, and think about the strange mathematics of justice. 7 co-defendants, they called us. 7 men who'd built lives and families and reputations in a world that operated by its own set of rules. The commission trial, they called it, as if we were some kind of board of directors meeting in mahogany-paneled rooms, instead of men who'd grown up in neighborhoods where survival was an art form and respect was currency. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were calling me the supreme boss while I sat there knowing I was really the designated target, the one whose name would look best in the headlines when it was all over. It's a role I'd played before, in smaller venues with lower stakes. The guy who takes the heat while everyone else fades into the background. There's honor in it, I suppose, though not the kind they write about in history books or teach in business schools. I remember looking around that courtroom on the final day and seeing faces I'd known for decades, some friendly, some not, all of them understanding that we were witnessing the end of something that had defined our world for longer than any of us cared to calculate. The prosecutors sat at their table with the satisfied look of hunters who'd finally cornered their prey, while the defense attorneys shuffled papers with the quiet resignation of men who'd fought the good fight and knew when it was time to surrender. But what struck me most was the silence that filled the spaces between Judge Owen's words. It was the kind of silence that comes after a long conversation has ended, when everything that needed to be said has been said, and all that's left is the echo of voices that will soon be just memories. In that silence I heard the footsteps of all the men who'd walked this path before me, and I felt the weight of all the men who'd walk it after. The 240,000 fine seemed almost quaint compared to the century they were giving me, numbers on paper, abstractions that had no more meaning than the score of a baseball game played in a city I'd never visit. The real cost wasn't something you could write on a check or calculate with a ledger. The real cost was measured in Sunday dinners that would happen without me, in grandchildren who would know me only through stories, in the slow fade of a voice that had once carried weight in rooms where important decisions were made. As they led me away that day, I found myself thinking about something my grandfather once told me while we sat on his stoop watching the neighborhood kids play stickball in the street. "Anthony," he said, his voice carrying the weight of old country wisdom, "a man's life isn't measured by how long he lives, but by how well he plays the hand he's dealt." At the time, I thought I understood what he meant. Now, walking through those courthouse corridors for the last time as a free man, I finally grasped the full weight of his words. The newspapers would continue their stories, painting pictures of empire and conspiracy, of power structures and criminal enterprises. But the truth was simpler and more complex than anything they could capture in their headlines. The truth was about neighborhoods and families, about traditions that stretched back generations, about men who found themselves playing roles in a drama that was bigger than any of them had ever imagined. And sometimes, when the curtain finally falls, someone has to take the bow, even when the applause sounds more like judgment than appreciation. I remember the morning when everything began to unravel, though I didn't know it then. It was March of 1986, and I was sitting in my favorite chair by the window, watching the steam rise from my coffee cup like ghostly fingers reaching toward heaven. The sunlight filtered through the Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across my newspaper, and something about that pattern should have warned me. But I was 68 years old, and I thought I had seen every trick the world could play. Phone call came at exactly 9:15. I know because I always checked my watch when the phone rang, a habit from the old days when timing meant the difference between freedom and a lifetime behind bars. Vincent's voice was tight, controlled, the way it got when he was trying not to wake sleeping giants. "Tony," he said, and I could hear the weight in that single word. "We got problems." I set down my coffee and leaned back in my chair, feeling the familiar leather conform to my body like an old friend's embrace. Through my window, I could see Mrs. Anes, Benedetto, hanging laundry on the line between our buildings, her movements methodical and peaceful. She had no idea that her quiet neighborhood was about to become the center of a storm that had been brewing for decades. "Tell me," I said, "because that's what you do when you've lived the life I've lived. You listen, you absorb, you think before you react." Vincent cleared his throat. "S&A Concrete. They're coming after the whole operation. Bid rigging charges, the works." I closed my eyes and felt something shift inside my chest, like a gear clicking into place. S&A Concrete. Our beautiful, perfectly orchestrated symphony of commerce and influence that had helped build half of Manhattan's skyline. For years we had moved through that world like conductors of an invisible orchestra, ensuring that the right bids went to the right companies, that concrete flowed where it needed to flow, that everyone who deserved to prosper did so. "Who's talking?" I asked, though part of me already knew. The silence on the other end told me everything. In our world, silence was often more eloquent than words. It spoke of betrayal, of carefully constructed walls crumbling, of trust dissolving like sugar in rain. I had built my life on concrete, not just the material that rose into towers and bridges, but the metaphorical foundation of loyalty, respect, and mutual understanding. I had always believed that if you treated people fairly, if you honored your agreements, if you showed proper respect to those who deserved it, then you could create something solid and lasting. But concrete, I was learning, was only as strong as the materials that went into it. Standing up from my chair, I walked to the window and looked out at the city that had shaped me, that I had helped shape in return. The morning light caught the windows of distant buildings, turning them into mirrors that reflected 1,000 different versions of the same sky. Each building had a story. Each story had players, and each player had made choices that led them to this moment. I thought about my father, dead now for 20 years, who had taught me that a man's word was his bond. He had been a simple man who worked with his hands, who came home every night with dirt under his fingernails and pride in his heart. "Anthony," he used to say, "the world is full of people who will try to make you into something you're not. Remember who you are." But who was I? Was I the neighborhood kid who had learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies of East Harlem? Was I the young man who had discovered that intelligence and patience could open doors that brute force could never touch? Was I the businessman who had built relationships across the city, creating networks of mutual benefit and shared prosperity? Or was I simply what they would call me in the newspapers? A criminal, a racketeer, a threat to society? The truth, I knew, was more complicated than any of those simple definitions. I was a product of my time and place, shaped by forces larger than myself, making choices within a system that had its own rules and logic. The concrete business wasn't just about concrete. It was about families feeding their children, about workers having steady employment, about a city that needed to grow and expand to accommodate its dreams. Vincent arrived at my apartment an hour later, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. He had the look of a man who had been carrying heavy news and was relieved to finally set it down. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had shared countless meals with friends and family, where I had made decisions that affected thousands of lives, where I had tried to balance the competing demands of business, loyalty, and survival. "How much do they know?" I asked, pouring him a cup of coffee from the pot that seemed to brew itself throughout the day. Vincent's hands wrapped around the warm ceramic like he was trying to draw strength from it. "Everything," he said. "The whole structure, how we coordinated the bids, how we allocated the contracts, how we made sure everyone got their fair share." I nodded slowly, processing this information the way I had learned to process all significant news, calmly, methodically, looking for angles and opportunities even in apparent disaster. And the Teamsters situation? That too. They're trying to connect everything, paint it all as one big conspiracy. For decades, I had worked to create order from chaos, to bring structure and fairness to industries that might otherwise have torn themselves apart through cutthroat competition. Yes, we had influenced elections, but only to ensure that reasonable people were in positions of influence. Yes, we had coordinated business practices, but only to prevent the kind of destructive price wars that benefited no one. I stood up and walked to my kitchen window, looking down at the street where I had played as a child, where I had learned the first lessons about loyalty and respect that had guided my entire life. An old man was walking his dog, stopping patiently while the animal investigated every lamppost and fire hydrant with the methodical thoroughness of a detective gathering evidence. "Vincent," I said, still watching the street, "what do you think they really want?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear him thinking, weighing his words. "They want to prove that everything we built was illegal, that all the relationships, all the mutual understanding, all the ways we made sure business got done efficiently. They want to call it all corruption, I turned back to face him, this man who had been by my side for so many years, who understood the delicate balance we had tried to maintain between competition and cooperation, between individual ambition and collective prosperity. And maybe, I said softly, they're not entirely wrong. The admission hung in the air between us like incense in a cathedral, heavy with implications and regret. I had spent my entire adult life building something I believed in, creating systems that worked, fostering relationships that benefited everyone involved. But I had also bent rules, influenced outcomes, and operated in shadows that the law was never meant to illuminate. That afternoon I called my lawyer, a brilliant man named Robert, who had the rare gift of understanding both the law as written and the law as practiced. We met in his office, a temple of leather-bound books and polished wood that spoke of tradition and stability. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits celebrating their freedom. "Anthony," Robert said, settling into his chair with the careful precision of a man who had learned that every word mattered, "we need to discuss your options." I listened as he laid out the legal landscape, the charges they were considering, the evidence they might present, the strategies we might employ. But part of my mind was elsewhere, remembering moments from my past that suddenly seemed to glow with new significance. I remembered the first time I'd walked into a union meeting, a young man trying to understand how power flowed through the complex ecosystem of labor and management. I remembered the satisfaction of solving problems that had seemed intractable, of finding ways for competing interests to coexist profitably. I remembered handshakes that had sealed deals worth millions, conversations in restaurants where the real business of the city had been conducted over plates of perfectly prepared pasta and glasses of wine that had been aging since before I was born. As Robert spoke, I found myself thinking about legacy, not the legacy that would be written in newspapers and court documents, but the real legacy that lived in the buildings that still stood, the families that had prospered, the workers who had found steady employment because we had created stability in an unstable world. The concrete business had taught me that strength came from the proper mixture of materials, from understanding how different elements could be combined to create something more durable than any of its individual components. But it had also taught me that even the strongest concrete could crack under sufficient pressure, that time and weather and the constant stress of supporting weight could eventually wear down even the most carefully constructed foundation. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment as the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded me of the sunsets of my childhood. The city spread out before me like a vast circuit board, its lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness, each light representing a life, a dream, a story unfolding in its own unique way. I thought about Vincent's words, about the investigation that was gathering momentum like a storm system moving in from the ocean. I thought about the choices that had brought me to this moment, the decisions that had seemed so clear and necessary at the time, but now appeared more ambiguous, more complex. Viewed through the lens of history and hindsight, tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations with lawyers and advisors, new strategies for navigating the treacherous waters that lay ahead. But tonight, in the quiet of my apartment, with the familiar sounds of the city humming softly beyond my windows, I allowed myself to remember not just what I had done, but why I had done it, and who I had been before the world decided to define me by my worst moments rather than my best. Intentions. The phone rang again, but I didn't answer it. Instead, I poured myself a small glass of wine and settled back into my chair, watching the city transform itself from day to night, from the harsh clarity of sunlight to the softer, more forgiving embrace of darkness. In a few hours I would sleep, and perhaps in my dreams I would find the peace that seemed increasingly elusive during my waking hours. But for now, I simply sat and remembered, holding on to the parts of my story that belonged to me alone, before they became part of someone else's narrative about crime and punishment, about right and wrong, about the price we pay for the choices we make in the complex, morally ambiguous world where most of us are forced to live. When the trials came, the mixed verdict felt almost anticlimactic. Acquitted on the Teamsters charges, a small victory in a larger defeat. Convicted on concrete extortion and racketeering, the weight of decades of careful construction finally crashing down. The additional 70 years felt like an echo of the 100 I was already carrying, numbers that had lost their meaning in the arithmetic of a life that would end behind bars. Vincent Fish Cafaro's betrayal, when it came, surprised no one who understood the pressures that federal investigators could bring to bear on a man with family, with vulnerabilities, with more to lose than his own freedom. Fish had been trusted, valued, brought into conversations that required the highest levels of discretion. But trust, I had learned, was just another material in the foundation of our world, and like concrete, it could crack under sufficient pressure. The Supreme Court's decision to reinstate my convictions came just weeks before my death, a final twist in a story that had already reached its inevitable conclusion. By then, I was too tired to care about appeals or legal technicalities. The strokes had taken their toll, the diabetes had weakened my body, and the weight of all those years, lived and sentenced, had compressed my world to the size of a hospital bed, and the memories that flickered through my fading consciousness like old movies projected on a cracked wall. The fluorescent lights in this place never sleep, just like the old neighborhood used to be. I lie here in my narrow bed at the medical center, listening to the hum of machines and thinking about how strange it is that a man can spend 80 years building something only to watch it crumble from a hospital bed. My name is Anthony Salerno, though most people knew me by other names. Fat Tony, Tony Ducks, names that carried weight on the streets of East Harlem and beyond. I suppose every man reaches a point where he looks back and wonders if the path he chose was the only one available to him, or if somewhere along the way he simply stopped seeing the other roads. For me, that wondering comes now in these quiet hours, when the diabetes makes my vision blur, and the effects of the strokes slow my thoughts to the pace of honey dripping from a spoon. My hands, once steady enough to shuffle cards for hours or count money with the precision of a bank teller, now shake slightly as I trace the patterns on this thin blanket. These same hands shook different hands in smoky back rooms, signed papers that moved mountains of money, and held the reins of an empire that stretched from the Bronx to Las Vegas. But they also held my mother's rosary, wiped away tears I'd never admit to shedding, and grasped the shoulders of men I loved like brothers. The Genovese family, my family, was never just about the business, though that's what the newspapers and the prosecutors never understood. We were a collection of souls bound together by something deeper than profit, something that grew from the soil of our neighborhoods, where Italian immigrants like my parents planted roots in American concrete. I remember walking those East Harlem streets as a young man, breathing in the aroma of fresh bread from Moretti's bakery mixing with the exhaust from the elevated trains, watching old men play boxer ball in Marcus Garvin's park, while their wives hung laundry between fire escapes like prayer flags. In those days, the early 1930s, the world was different. Men wore their hats with purpose, women carried themselves with dignity born from struggle, and respect wasn't just a word you threw around, it was currency more valuable than the dollars in your pocket. I learned early that in our world, your word was your bond, and breaking it was worse than any physical wound you could inflict or receive. The Depression had everyone scrambling, but we found ways to take care of our own, to create order in chaos. I think about Vincent Gigante often these days, my old friend Chin, with his brilliant mind hidden behind that crazy act of his. People thought he was losing his marbles, wandering around Greenwich Village in his bathrobe, mumbling to himself, but I knew better. Chin was playing the longest con of all, and watching him work was like watching a master chess player think 15 moves ahead, while his opponent was still trying to remember how the pieces moved. We'd sit in the back of Sullivan Street Social Club, steam rising from our espresso cups, and I'd catch the glint in his eyes that told me everything was calculated, every stumble and mumble carefully choreographed. The social club that was our office, our sanctuary, our confessional, all rolled into one. The walls were painted that particular shade of green that seemed to exist only in Italian-American establishments, and the air was thick with cigar smoke and the weight of whispered conversations. There was a photograph of Frank Sinatra hanging next to one of the Pope, because in our world, you honored both earthly and divine power with equal reverence. I spent countless hours at that round table in the back corner, the one with a slight wobble that everyone knew about but no one ever fixed, conducting business that would ripple out across the 5 boroughs and beyond. Money flowed through our hands like water, but it was never just about accumulating wealth. It was about creating a structure, a system where everyone had their place and their purpose. The numbers, runners, the loan sharks, the legitimate businessmen who needed our protection, they were all part of an intricate web that I helped weave and maintain. When someone came to me with a problem, whether it was difficulty collecting a debt or trouble with competing interests moving in on their territory, they weren't just hiring muscle. They were appealing to a form of justice that existed parallel to the courts and police stations, one that operated by older rules and ancient codes of honor. I remember one particular evening in the late 1970s, sitting in my favorite restaurant on Arthur Avenue, watching the sun set through windows that had seen decades of similar dinners. The place smelled like garlic and basil, and the owner, Sal Benedetto, moved between tables like he was conducting a symphony, making sure every customer felt like family. That night, a young man approached our table with trembling hands and a story about his sister being harassed by some punk who wouldn't take no for an answer. The kid had nowhere else to turn, the police had brushed him off, and he didn't have money for lawyers. I listened to his whole story while cutting my veal with surgical precision, never interrupting, letting him pour out his fear and frustration. When he finished, I set down my fork and looked at him for a long moment. "What's your sister's name?" I asked. "Maria," he whispered. I nodded and told him to go home, that Maria would have no more problems. 3 days later, the punk in question decided to take an extended vacation in Florida, and Maria could walk to work again without looking over her shoulder. The young man tried to pay me, but I waved him away. Some things you do because they're right, not because they're profitable. That was the part of my life that the federal prosecutors never wanted to understand during all those trials and investigations. They saw only the criminal enterprise, the flow of illegal money, the violence that sometimes became necessary to maintain order. They couldn't see the community we protected, the problems we solved, the peace we kept in our own way. To them, I was simply the head of a criminal organization. To the people in our neighborhoods, I was something more complex, part judge, part protector, part businessman, all wrapped up in a code of conduct that predated their laws by centuries. The strokes came gradually at first, little warnings that my body was growing tired of carrying the weight I'd asked it to bear. I'd be in the middle of a conversation and suddenly lose the thread of what I was saying, or reach for a glass and find my hand moving in the wrong direction. The doctors at Springfield try to explain it in medical terms: blood flow, brain tissue, arterial damage. But I understand it differently. After 8 decades of intense living, my mind is simply choosing which memories to keep sharp and which to let fade into comfortable shadows. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn when the medical center settles into its deepest sleep, I find myself back in my mother's kitchen on East 160th Street, watching her roll pasta dough with the same methodical precision I would later apply to entirely different endeavors. Her hands were small but strong, shaped by years of hard work, and she hummed old Italian songs while she cooked. The kitchen always smelled like Sunday tomato sauce simmering with fresh basil, bread warming in the oven, the lingering aroma of her morning coffee. "Antonio," she would say, using my full name the way mothers do when they want your complete attention. "Remember that how you treat people when you have power shows who you really are." She never knew the specifics of how I would eventually wield that power, but somehow her words became the foundation for everything that followed. Even in the darkest moments of my life, when difficult decisions had to be made and lines had to be drawn, I carried her voice with me like a compass, pointing toward whatever honor could be found in an inherently dishonorable world. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm ending my days in a federal facility, surrounded by the very system I spent my life circumventing. But there's a strange peace in it too, a sense that all the running and hiding and maneuvering has finally led to this quiet place where the only battles left to fight are with my own failing body. The young agents who used to follow me, photographing my movements and recording my conversations, have moved on to pursuing other targets. The empire I helped build has found new leadership, new methods, new challenges. Life, as it always does, continues without me. In these final chapters, I find myself thinking less about the money that was made and lost, the territories that were won and surrendered, the enemies who were defeated and the friends who were betrayed. Instead, I remember the weight of responsibility I carried for so many years, the knowledge that hundreds of people depended on the decisions I made in those smoky back rooms. I think about the delicate balance we maintained between the world we created and the larger world that surrounded it, and how that balance required constant vigilance, endless calculation, and occasionally acts of mercy that could never be spoken about openly. As my 80th year draws to its close, I realize that the true measure of any life isn't found in its public accomplishments or failures, but in the private moments of connection between human beings. The rest, the newspaper headlines, the federal indictments, the Hollywood interpretations, that's just noise echoing in empty rooms after the real story has already been lived and the real players have taken their final bows. The morning of July 27th, 1992, arrived with the kind of summer heat that makes even the air conditioning struggle. I woke early, as I'd been doing for months, my body's internal clock refusing to acknowledge the artificial rhythms of institutional life. The massive stroke, when it came, felt like a door closing, not violently but with the gentle finality of someone leaving a room for the last time and turning off the lights behind them. In those final moments, I wasn't thinking about the trials or the sentences or the headlines that would mark my passing. I was thinking about a little boy in East Harlem, standing on a fire escape and watching the sun set over a neighborhood that believed in taking care of its own. I was thinking about my mother's hands kneading dough, my father's quiet dignity, and all the people whose lives had intersected with mine in ways both large and small. They would bury me at St. Swall, Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, not far from the streets where I learned everything I needed to know about loyalty, respect, and the price of living by your own rules. The newspapers would write their final stories. The Hollywood producers would option my life for movies that would turn me into a cartoon version of myself. And somewhere in Springfield, Massachusetts, a cartoon character named Fat Tony would stumble his way through adventures that bore no resemblance to the man who inspired his name. But that's how legends work, I suppose. They take the facts of a life and reshape them into something more palatable, more entertaining, more easily digestible than the complicated truth. The real Anthony Salerno, the boy who carried numbers for nickels, the young man who learned that respect was earned through consistency, the older man who tried to balance the competing demands of business and conscience, that person would fade into memory, replaced by the myth that better served. The needs of a world that preferred its heroes and villains, clearly labelled and easily understood. As I felt consciousness slipping away like water through cupped hands, I took comfort in knowing that somewhere in the Bronx and East Harlem, in the social clubs and corner stores where men still gathered to argue about baseball and politics, people would remember not the headlines but the man-flawed, complicated human who had tried to live by a code that meant something in a world that often seemed to mean nothing at all.